The evening air hung thick over Harlem on that September night in 1935, carrying with it the mingled scents of frying fish, tobacco smoke, and the peculiar electricity that only a Friday night in the city could generate. The street lights cast pools of yellow across West 142nd Street, illuminating the faces of men and women dressed in their finest, heading toward the Cotton Club, that glittering palace of entertainment, where the greatest Negro musicians in America performed for audiences that would never allow them to sit among the patrons they were entertaining. It was precisely 8:23 in the evening when Ellsworth Raymond Jonson, known throughout Harlem by the name Bumpy, approached the brass-handled doors of that establishment, his shoes clicking against the pavement with the confidence of a man who had built an empire in the shadows, who controlled more money and more power than most men would see in 10 lifetimes, who walked through Harlem streets like a king moving through his kingdom. He wore a suit that had been tailored on 7th Avenue by a man who understood that true elegance was not about flash or ostentation, but about perfect fit and quality fabric, a charcoal gray that caught the light just so, with a white shirt pressed until it was crisp as paper and a silk tie the color of burgundy wine. His shoes had been shined that afternoon by old Marcus at the stand on Lenox Avenue, buffed until they reflected the world like black mirrors. He looked, in every respect, like a gentleman, like a man of means and education, like someone who belonged anywhere he chose to be. But belonging, in 1935 New York, was not determined by appearance or wealth or accomplishment when the color of your skin marked you as someone who could be turned away from establishments that existed only because of the culture and talent of people who shared that skin. Welcome to this channel. Today we step into a case that is not just difficult to understand, it reshapes the meaning of fear itself. Like the video, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The Cotton Club stood before him like a monument to contradiction, its facade gleaming, music spilling out into the street, the sound of Duke Ellington's orchestra weaving through the night air like silk ribbons. Inside those walls, Negro musicians created art that made white people travel uptown from their safe neighborhoods in Manhattan, seeking the exotic thrill of hearing authentic jazz played by the men who invented it, served drinks by Negro waiters, surrounded by the atmosphere of Harlem, while remaining completely insulated from any actual contact with Harlem's residents as equals. The club's owner had built his fortune understanding that white people would pay premium prices to experience Negro culture, as long as they could do so without having to acknowledge Negro humanity, could consume the art while refusing to share space with the artists, could profit from blackness while maintaining absolute segregation. Bumpy Jonson understood all of this as he walked toward that entrance, understood it in his bones the way a man understands the rules of a game he has been forced to play his entire life. He had been invited to the Cotton Club that evening by a white businessman named Weinstein, a man who operated several legitimate enterprises in Harlem, and who apparently believed that an invitation from him would be sufficient to override the club's notorious policy of excluding Negro patrons. Weinstein had suggested they meet at the Cotton Club to discuss certain business arrangements, speaking with the casual confidence of a white man who assumed that exceptions could be made, that rules could be bent, that surely someone as important as Bumpy Jonson would be admitted despite his race. Standing at the entrance was a doorman named Murphy, a thick-necked Irish immigrant who had been given the authority to decide who belonged inside the Cotton Club and who did not, whose job consisted primarily of admitting well-dressed white people while turning away any person of color who attempted to enter as a patron rather than as staff. Murphy saw Jonson approaching and stepped directly into his path, blocking the doorway with his considerable bulk, his face settling into an expression that combined contempt and certainty, the look of a man who knew exactly what he was about to do and who had done it so many times before that it had become routine. The words that came out of Murphy's mouth were delivered loud enough to carry across the sidewalk to the other patrons waiting to enter, ensuring that everyone present would witness this encounter, would see a Negro man being put in his place, would understand that the Cotton Club's rules were absolute regardless of how well-dressed or seemingly important the person being turned away might be. Murphy said, "Where exactly do you think you're headed, boy? This establishment is for white patrons exclusively. We don't serve colored folks here, except as performers and staff. You need to head back to wherever you came from and stop trying to enter places where you're not welcome. Now move along before I telephone the police and have you arrested for loitering." The word boy hung in the air like a slap. It was not merely a descriptor but an insult refined over centuries of slavery and subjugation, a word designed to reduce grown men to children, to strip away dignity and accomplishment and humanity, to remind every Negro person that regardless of what they had achieved or how they presented themselves, white society would always view them as inferior, as servants, as less than fully human. Bumpy Jonson stood perfectly still, his face revealing nothing, his eyes fixed on Murphy's face with an intensity that made the Doorman's certainty flicker for just a moment, long enough for Murphy to wonder if perhaps he had made an error in judgment, if perhaps this particular Negro man was someone who should have been recognized. But the moment passed, and Murphy's confidence returned, bolstered by the presence of white patrons behind Jonson, by the knowledge that he had the full weight of the Cotton Club's management and white society's racial codes supporting his authority to exclude this man regardless of who he might be. Behind Jonson, the line of white people waiting to enter watched this confrontation with varying expressions. Some looked amused, entertained by the spectacle of a well-dressed colored man being denied entry, finding humor in his presumption that he might be admitted. Others appeared mildly uncomfortable, their faces showing the cognitive dissonance of people who enjoyed Negro entertainment, but preferred not to think too carefully about the contradiction of excluding Negro patrons from establishments that depended entirely on Negro talent. A few nodded approvingly, satisfied that proper boundaries were being maintained, that this Negro man was being reminded of his place in the social order. Jonson could feel their eyes on him, could hear murmured comments about uppity colored people and the importance of knowing one's place, could sense that arguing with Murphy would accomplish nothing except providing entertainment for these white spectators, would result in police being summoned and Jonson being arrested or beaten or both, would become an anecdote these people would share with their friends about the Negro man who tried to force his way into the Cotton Club and was properly dealt with by the authorities. Every instinct Jonson had developed over years of navigating a world designed to humiliate and diminish him told him that violence would be counterproductive, that making a scene would only confirm white people's assumptions about Negro aggression and criminality, that the smart play was to walk away and find another method of addressing this insult. So Jonson did something that required more self-control than most men possessed. He smiled. Not a warm smile, not a genuine expression of humor or friendliness, but a cold, measured curve of his lips that suggested he was memorizing Murphy's face, and this moment, cataloging them for future reference, filing away the details of this humiliation so that, when the appropriate time came, he would remember exactly what had been done to him and exactly who had done it. Jonson held Murphy's gaze for 3 full seconds, long enough that Murphy's expression shifted slightly, the contempt giving way to a flicker of uncertainty as he recognized something in Jonson's eyes that indicated this encounter had not ended the way Murphy assumed it had ended, that something was beginning rather than concluding. Then Jonson nodded once, a gesture that could have meant acceptance but actually meant something entirely different, turned away from the Cotton Club's entrance, and walked back down West 142nd Street toward Lenox Avenue. His posture straight, his pace measured and unhurried, giving no indication to anyone watching that he had just experienced public humiliation, that he had been dismissed and insulted in front of white strangers who believed they had the right to exclude him from spaces they controlled. He walked through Harlem's Friday evening streets without any particular destination, moving through the familiar landscape of his neighborhood, past storefronts and churches and apartment buildings where people who looked like him lived lives constrained by rules they had no part in creating. He walked for 20 minutes, long enough for his anger to settle from a white-hot rage into something colder and more dangerous, the kind of calculated fury that produced strategy rather than violence, that generated plans rather than immediate retaliation. He found himself standing outside the Savoy Ballroom on Lenox Avenue, watching Negro patrons entering an establishment that welcomed them, that was owned and operated by colored businessmen, that provided entertainment and social opportunities without the degradation that came from trying to enter white establishments that treated Negro people as servants or criminals or both. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Standing there watching people enter the Savoy, Jonson experienced a moment of clarity that would alter not just his own trajectory, but eventually transform the economic structure of Harlem's entertainment industry in ways that would reverberate for decades. The Cotton Club existed in Harlem, on a Harlem street, employing Harlem musicians and Harlem staff, generating enormous sums of money from white people who traveled uptown specifically to visit that establishment. But despite being physically located in Harlem, and despite depending entirely on Negro talent and Negro labor, the Cotton Club was owned by white gangsters, operated according to white rules, and excluded the Negro community from participating as customers. The establishment extracted wealth from Harlem, consumed the creativity of Negro musicians, exploited the labor of Negro workers, traded on the cultural reputation of being located in Harlem, while giving almost nothing back to the community except minimum wage employment for the musicians and staff it could not avoid hearing. What Jonson realized standing outside the Savoy was that this arrangement, white people owning establishments in Harlem that profited from Negro culture while excluding Negro patrons, existed only because Negro Harlem lacked the economic power and organizational capacity to challenge it effectively. The Cotton Club's owners assumed they could maintain their discriminatory policies indefinitely because what could Negro Harlem do about it? Colored patrons could not force their way in through physical intimidation. Negro musicians needed the employment too desperately to organize boycotts. Negro workers could not afford to quit their positions on principle when jobs were scarce during the Depression years. The Cotton Club's owners had calculated correctly that individual Negro people lacked the power to challenge an established white-owned business that enjoyed the protection of wealthy white patrons and corrupt political connections. But what the Cotton Club's owners had not calculated, what they could not have anticipated, was that someone with Bumpy Jonson's resources and Bumpy Jonson's connections and Bumpy Jonson's willingness to employ criminal methods for purposes beyond mere profit-making might decide that being turned away from the Cotton Club's entrance was an insult demanding a response not through violence, but through systematic economic warfare designed to make the club's discriminatory policies so expensive and problematic that the establishment would either change or fail. Jonson walked to a telephone booth on the corner of Lenox Avenue and made 3 calls that would set everything into motion. The first call was to Theodore Green, Jonson's attorney and most trusted advisor, a Harvard-educated colored lawyer who had dedicated his practice to serving Harlem's community and who understood both the law and how to work around it when necessary. The second call was to Stephanie St. Clair, known as Madame Queen, who controlled substantial gambling operations throughout Harlem and who had been Jonson's mentor years earlier before Jonson built his own independent organization, a woman whose intelligence and ruthlessness were legendary in the underworld. The third call was to Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Sr., minister of Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most influential legitimate leaders, a man who had been fighting discrimination for decades, but who had never possessed the kind of raw power necessary to actually force white establishments to change rather than merely preaching about how discrimination was morally wrong. By midnight Friday, Jonson had assembled approximately 18 people in the back room of a speakeasy on 133rd Street, gathering his own top associates, representatives from other Negro policy operators, union officials who controlled colored workers in service industries, ministers from major Harlem churches, and several Negro professionals, including doctors and lawyers, who had experienced their own humiliations at white establishments, and who understood exactly what Jonson was proposing. Jonson stood at the head of the table and described what had happened at the Cotton Club, speaking in his characteristic quiet voice that made people lean forward to hear him. And as he spoke, he watched the faces around the table transform from curiosity about why they had been summoned to anger about what Jonson was describing to something that resembled hunger, because they understood that if Bumpy Jonson was assembling this particular group of people, then he was planning something substantial, something that transcended his personal revenge. Jonson said, his voice carrying that particular controlled intensity that people who knew him recognized as more dangerous than shouting, "The Cotton Club turned me away tonight because I'm colored. The doorman called me boy and instructed me to return to Harlem where I belong. The irony, naturally, is that the Cotton Club is in Harlem. It sits on West 142nd Street, right in the heart of our neighborhood. It employs our musicians, our waiters, our cooks, our cleaning staff. It generates its revenue from being located in Harlem and from featuring Negro entertainment. But it refuses to allow Negro people to sit in the audience. It takes everything from us, our talent, our labor, our neighborhood's reputation, and gives us nothing in return except minimum wages and the privilege of serving white people who come to Harlem to be entertained by our culture, while ensuring we understand we're not worthy of sharing their tables." Jonson paused, allowing his words to settle over the room, observing the faces around the table as several people nodded in recognition, understanding their own experiences reflected in what Jonson described, comprehending that the Cotton Club's discrimination was not unique, but was instead representative of a broader pattern where white people profited from Negro culture, while maintaining strict segregation that ensured Negro people remained subordinate. Jonson continued, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to strain to hear him. But here's what the Cotton Club's owners fail to understand. They fail to understand that they're vulnerable in ways they haven't considered. The Cotton Club depends on Negro labor. Every musician, every waiter, every cook, every person who makes that establishment function is colored. The Cotton Club depends on being located in Harlem. Its entire appeal to white downtown patrons is that it offers an exotic experience of visiting a Negro neighborhood to witness Negro entertainment. And the Cotton Club depends on Harlem tolerating its presence, depends on us not making trouble, not organizing resistance, not utilizing the power we actually possess to make operating a discriminatory establishment in our neighborhood so difficult and so expensive that it becomes unsustainable. Jonson stood now, beginning to pace behind the table, his intensity building as he laid out his vision. "So here's our course of action. We're going to teach the Cotton Club's owners that extracting wealth from Harlem while insulting Harlem's people carries a cost. We're not going to burn the establishment down. That would merely provide them insurance money and sympathy. We're not going to attack their white patrons. That would give police justification to crack down on all of us. Instead, we're going to make operating the Cotton Club so difficult, so expensive, and so problematic that the owners conclude they have two options. Either they open the Cotton Club to Negro patrons and terminate their discriminatory policies, or they sell the establishment to Negro owners who will operate it as an integrated venue. Either outcome, the current arrangement, white people profiting from Negro culture while excluding Negro people from participating as equals, terminates." What followed was 3 hours of detailed planning, as Jonson and the assembled group developed a comprehensive strategy that combined labor organizing, economic pressure, community mobilization, and the kind of subtle intimidation that criminals understood how to apply without triggering police response. The plan had multiple components that would be implemented simultaneously over the coming weeks, creating pressure from every direction, until the Cotton Club's owners concluded that maintaining their discriminatory policies was simply too expensive. First, labor organization. Every Negro employee of the Cotton Club would be contacted and recruited to participate in coordinated action. Musicians would be approached and asked to demand substantially higher wages and improved working conditions, threatening to strike if their demands were not met. Waiters and kitchen staff would be organized to subtly slow down service, making the Cotton Club's operations less efficient without doing anything so obvious that they could be terminated for sabotage. The objective was to increase the Cotton Club's labor expenses and reduce its service quality sufficiently that white patrons began complaining and operating profits declined. Second, supply disruptions. The Cotton Club depended on various suppliers for food, liquor, linens, and other essentials necessary to operate a nightclub. Through Jonson's connections and through Madame Queen's extensive network, these suppliers would be contacted and presented with a choice: cease doing business with the Cotton Club, or face serious problems with their other Harlem customers, and potentially with their ability to operate in Harlem at all. Since most suppliers conducted substantial business throughout Harlem, losing access to Harlem's broader market was more costly than losing the Cotton Club's business alone. The suppliers who agreed to stop servicing the Cotton Club would force the establishment to locate alternative suppliers at higher costs and with less reliability, gradually increasing operational expenses. Third, community pressure. Harlem's churches and community organizations would launch public campaigns criticizing the Cotton Club's discriminatory policies, making it a subject of Sunday sermons and community meetings, creating social pressure that made the Cotton Club's racism explicit and public rather than unspoken and ignored. The objective was not necessarily to prevent white patrons from visiting. White people would do as they pleased regardless of what Negro Harlem thought, but to create sufficient public controversy that the Cotton Club's policies became indefensible and embarrassing, potentially attracting unwanted attention from reform-minded politicians and journalists who might find the contradiction between the club's location in Harlem and its exclusion of Negro patrons to be newsworthy. Fourth, political complications. Through connections with corrupt police officers and politicians who owed favors to Jonson, or who could be persuaded through financial incentives, minor legal and regulatory problems would be manufactured for the Cotton Club. Health inspections would suddenly identify violations requiring expensive corrections. Fire safety reviews would discover concerns needing immediate attention. Liquor license renewals would be delayed, creating uncertainty about whether the club could legally serve alcohol, which would devastate business. None of these problems individually would shut down the Cotton Club, but collectively they would cost substantial money and management attention, and would make operating the business significantly more complicated. Fifth, economic competition. Jonson and Madame Queen would invest in establishing or supporting alternative entertainment venues in Harlem that welcomed Negro patrons, venues that could compete with the Cotton Club by offering comparable quality entertainment in integrated settings. If Negro musicians could earn similar or better compensation performing at integrated venues, if Negro workers could find employment at establishments that did not practice discrimination, then the Cotton Club would struggle to maintain the Negro talent and labor it depended on, creating a competitive disadvantage that would erode its market position over time. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The strategy was sophisticated and comprehensive, combining methods that ranged from completely legitimate labor organizing to barely legal intimidation, leveraging every form of power that Negro Harlem possessed to challenge an establishment that had assumed Negro Harlem was powerless to resist. Everyone in that room understood they were participating in something unprecedented, a moment when criminal resources and criminal methods were being weaponized not for personal profit, but for a social objective, when Bumpy Jonson's anger about being turned away from the Cotton Club was being channeled into systematic organizing that could actually transform the economic structure of Harlem's entertainment industry. The campaign against the Cotton Club commenced the following Monday, September 23, 1935, when Duke Ellington, who had built his reputation performing at the Cotton Club and who remained the establishment's most significant draw, announced to the club's management that he was demanding a 50% increase in his orchestra's compensation and substantially improved working conditions, including better dressing facilities, meal provisions, and respectful treatment from management. When management refused, pointing out that Ellington had a contract that did not expire for another 6 months, Ellington responded that contracts could be broken and that he had received multiple offers from other venues willing to pay him substantially more than the Cotton Club was currently paying. The threat was credible because Jonson and Madame Queen had indeed contacted Ellington with lucrative offers to perform at alternative venues, and Ellington, who had experienced his own humiliations from Cotton Club management over the years, was willing to leverage those offers to extract better terms or to depart entirely if better terms were not provided. Simultaneously, problems began manifesting throughout the Cotton Club's operations in ways that management initially attributed to coincidence, but that quickly revealed a pattern suggesting coordinated sabotage. Kitchen staff started working more slowly, claiming they were being extra careful about food preparation and safety, but actually coordinating to reduce the number of meals they could prepare per hour, creating longer wait times for white patrons unaccustomed to waiting for anything in establishments where they expected perfect service. Waiters began making small errors, delivering incorrect orders, forgetting drinks, taking longer than necessary to bring checks, not sufficient to justify termination, but enough to create frustration among patrons who expected flawless service and who began complaining to management about declining quality. Suppliers began experiencing mysterious problems delivering on schedule. Trucks broke down with unusual frequency. Orders were incorrectly filled. Deliveries scheduled for Monday would not arrive until Wednesday or Thursday, forcing the Cotton Club to scramble for alternatives and to pay premium prices for emergency rush deliveries from suppliers willing to accommodate last-minute requests. By the second week of the campaign, the Cotton Club's management was struggling with cascading problems they could not quite identify the source of, but that were clearly costing significant money and negatively affecting the customer experience in ways that threatened the club's reputation. Duke Ellington was threatening to terminate his contract and perform elsewhere, which would devastate the club's ability to attract white patrons who traveled uptown specifically to hear his orchestra perform. Labor costs were increasing as management provided raises to key employees to prevent them from leaving for other establishments. Supply costs were escalating as they paid premiums for reliable deliveries and emergency provisions. And mysteriously, various regulatory agencies were suddenly identifying problems requiring expensive corrections. The health department wanted improvements to the kitchen ventilation and food storage. The fire department wanted additional emergency exits installed and existing exits widened. The Liquor Licensing Authority was raising questions about whether the club's ownership structure fully complied with various regulations governing establishments serving alcohol, creating uncertainty that made the club's accountants nervous about future revenue. The Cotton Club's owner, Oni Madden, a white gangster who had built his fortune on bootlegging during Prohibition and who had purchased the Cotton Club in 1923, understood that someone was orchestrating this pressure, that these problems were not coincidental occurrences, but were instead coordinated attacks designed to make his business unsustainable. Madden had connections to other white organized crime figures throughout New York, had cultivated relationships with corrupt politicians and police officials, had resources that should have allowed him to identify and crush whoever was causing trouble for his establishment. But when Madden reached out to his contacts requesting assistance identifying who was behind the Cotton Club's mounting problems, he kept hearing the same name repeated, Bumpy Jonson. And when Madden attempted to leverage his organized crime connections to pressure Jonson into ceasing whatever he was doing, Madden discovered that none of the white gangsters he knew were willing to intervene in a conflict between Madden and Jonson over what was essentially a racial issue in Harlem, a neighborhood where white gangsters had limited influence, and where Jonson had built relationships and accumulated power that made him more formidable in Harlem than any outside figure could hope to be. White gangsters were willing to work with Jonson on various criminal enterprises, were willing to maintain cordial relations with him as long as he stayed in Harlem, and did not interfere with their operations in other parts of the city. But they were not willing to start a gang war over Madden's right to exclude Negro patrons from his nightclub, particularly when doing so would jeopardize their own profitable relationships with Jonson and other Harlem operators. After 3 weeks of mounting problems and escalating costs that were cutting deeply into the Cotton Club's profits, Madden received a message requesting that he meet with Theodore Green, the attorney who represented various Harlem interests including Bumpy Jonson. Madden agreed to the meeting, assuming this was an attempt to negotiate some kind of settlement that would allow him to resolve the situation without completely surrendering his position. On a Tuesday afternoon in mid-October 1935, Madden sat in Green's law office in Harlem, listening to a carefully worded explanation of exactly what was happening and exactly what would be required to make the problem cease. Green said, speaking with the precise diction of a Harvard-educated lawyer who understood how to communicate threats without making statements that could be used against him in court, "Mr. Madden, the operational difficulties you have been experiencing at the Cotton Club are the direct result of organized response to your establishment's policy of refusing admission to Negro patrons. This policy is deeply offensive to Harlem's community, is particularly offensive given that your establishment is located in Harlem and depends entirely on Negro musicians and Negro staff, and is no longer acceptable to the people who make your business possible. The difficulties will continue and will intensify progressively until you publicly announce that the Cotton Club will open its doors to Negro patrons, that colored customers will be welcomed and served with the same courtesy extended to white customers, and that you will take concrete demonstrable steps to prove this change is genuine rather than merely a public relations gesture." Madden's face flushed with anger as he absorbed what Green was telling him. He responded harshly, his voice rising, "You're informing me that colored people are sabotaging my business, that Bumpy Jonson is orchestrating this. I could have that man killed tomorrow. I have connections throughout this entire city. You actually believe some Harlem policy operator can threaten me and get away with it?" Green's expression remained completely neutral, showing no reaction to Madden's anger or threats. He said calmly, "Mr. Madden, you are certainly welcome to attempt retaliation against Mr. Jonson if you believe that represents a wise course of action. However, I should inform you that Mr. Jonson has anticipated that possibility and has taken extensive precautions. If anything unfortunate were to happen to Mr. Jonson, the campaign against your establishment would intensify dramatically rather than stopping, because Mr. Jonson has organized a coalition of individuals and organizations who will continue applying pressure regardless of what happens to him personally. And more importantly, Mr. Madden, you should carefully consider whether the Cotton Club is worth dying over, because if you attempt violence against Mr. Jonson will respond with violence against you, and you will discover that you have considerably less protection in Harlem than you currently believe you possess. The threat was explicit and was backed by a reality that Madden understood once his initial anger cooled sufficiently to allow strategic thinking. He could probably arrange to have Jonson killed if he committed sufficient resources and accepted the risks involved. But doing so would trigger a gang war that would cost far more than the Cotton Club was worth, would attract attention from law enforcement that Madden wanted to avoid, and would accomplish nothing because the coalition Jonson had assembled would continue pressuring the Cotton Club even after Jonson was dead. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Madden was confronting the same calculation that had defeated other white gangsters who had tried to maintain control in Harlem against Jonson's resistance. The recognition that fighting Jonson in Harlem cost more than any possible benefit from winning. That Jonson had resources and community support that made him effectively unbeatable in his own territory. Madden asked, his voice controlled again as he recognized this was a negotiation rather than a situation he could resolve through violence. What exactly are your demands? What specific actions do you require? Green pulled out a document he had prepared in advance, a proposed public statement that Madden would issue, declaring that the Cotton Club would no longer refuse service based on race. The statement did not require Madden to actively recruit Negro patrons or to make dramatic changes to how the club operated in other respects. Merely required him to publicly commit that colored customers who attempted to enter would be admitted and served rather than being turned away at the door as they had been historically. The announcement would be publicized through Harlem's newspapers and churches, would be verified by having prominent Negro community members attempt to enter the club and be admitted without incident, and would result in the termination of the campaign against the Cotton Club if Madden maintained the policy genuinely rather than merely issuing false statements while continuing to discriminate in actual practice. Madden spent another 90 minutes negotiating specific language and specific commitments, attempting to preserve as much of the Cotton Club's existing character and clientele as possible, while accepting the fundamental requirement that racial discrimination at the entrance had to terminate. Finally, on October 15, 1935, Oni Madden issued a public statement announcing that the Cotton Club would henceforth welcome patrons regardless of race, that the club's historical policy of admitting only white customers was being changed effective immediately, that colored customers who wished to attend performances would be admitted and served with courtesy and professionalism. The announcement was met with considerable skepticism from many in Harlem's community who assumed this was merely a public relations gesture that would not translate into genuine change, that Negro people who attempted to enter would still find ways to be turned away or would be treated so poorly that they would leave voluntarily. To verify the policy was authentic, Theodore Green organized a test on the evening of October 18, 1935, arranging for a group of well-dressed Negro professionals, including doctors, lawyers, teachers, and business people, to arrive at the Cotton Club and attempt to enter for the evening's performance. The Doorman Murphy, who had turned away Bumpy Jonson 4 weeks earlier, and who had presumably been instructed about the policy change and the consequences of failing to implement it, admitted the Negro patrons without incident, though witnesses reported that his expression suggested he found the experience deeply unpleasant. The Negro patrons were seated in the audience alongside white customers, were served by waiters with the same professionalism extended to white patrons, and were able to enjoy Duke Ellington's orchestra performing from the audience rather than being excluded, while their culture was performed for white people's entertainment. The integration of the Cotton Club sent shock waves through Harlem's community and beyond, because if the Cotton Club, the most famous whites-only establishment in Harlem, could be forced to integrate through organized economic pressure and strategic application of power, Then the model could be replicated against other discriminatory establishments throughout the city. Over the following months, Jonson and his coalition applied similar pressure to other venues that practiced discrimination, gradually forcing integration throughout Harlem's entertainment industry and creating precedents that would influence civil rights organizing for decades to come. Some establishments integrated immediately rather than fighting, understanding that resistance would be expensive and ultimately futile. Others attempted to resist, but discovered they faced the same mounting problems and escalating costs that had forced Madden to capitulate. And eventually, they too announced policy changes allowing Negro patrons. But perhaps more significant than the immediate victories was what Jonson accomplished in demonstrating a new model for challenging discrimination. What he proved after being turned away from the Cotton Club was that economic power, when organized systematically and applied strategically, could force changes that moral appeals and legal challenges alone could not produce. The methods Jonson pioneered, combining labor organization, supply disruptions, community mobilization, targeted economic pressure, and subtle intimidation into comprehensive campaigns against discriminatory establishments, would be studied and adapted by civil rights activists throughout the 1940s, 50s, and 60s as they worked to dismantle segregation across America. And Bumpy Jonson, who had walked away quietly from the Cotton Club's entrance on that September evening in 1935, rather than making a scene or resorting to immediate violence, had accomplished something that mattered more than any personal revenge could have mattered. He had demonstrated that being told to get back to Harlem, where you belong, could become the catalyst for taking control of Harlem's economic institutions, for forcing white-owned establishments to either integrate or leave, for proving that Negro Harlem possessed power that white people had dismissed or ignored, and that this power, when organized and applied strategically, could change the rules governing who belonged where and who had the right to exclude whom. The doorman who had called Bumpy Jonson boy and instructed him to return to Harlem probably never knew that his insult triggered everything that followed, probably continued working at the Cotton Club after it integrated, probably never understood that his casual racism had been the spark igniting a systematic campaign to break down the barriers that people like him maintained through casual contempt, delivered at doorways throughout the city. But that insult and Jonson's quiet departure followed by strategic organizing that transformed Harlem's entertainment landscape became legend in the community, became a story told to children and grandchildren about how power is not always about violence or immediate retaliation, but can be about patience and organization, and applying pressure systematically, until institutions break under the weight of their own contradictions. The words had been "You don't belong here, boy," and Bumpy Jonson's response, walking away quietly, organizing comprehensively, applying pressure methodically, changing Harlem permanently, proved that belonging is not something white doormen grant or deny, but is something people with sufficient intelligence and sufficient determination claim for themselves and for their communities. If you're still listening, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to this channel, and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? That was the insult that transformed Harlem. That was the quiet departure that broke the Cotton Club's color barrier. That was how one man's humiliation became an entire community's victory, not through violence or destruction, but through the harder work of organizing people and resources toward an objective requiring patience and coordination and willingness to maintain pressure, until the powerful concluded that maintaining discrimination cost more than abandoning it. The Cotton Club integrated in October 1935 because Bumpy Jonson decided being turned away from its entrance demanded a response that would matter beyond his personal satisfaction, and that decision to respond strategically rather than emotionally, to organize collectively rather than acting individually, to pursue lasting change rather than immediate revenge, established precedents and demonstrated methods that influenced how Negro Americans fought for their rights for generations to come. the story of what happened when a doorman at the Cotton Club called Bumpy Jonson boy and told him to leave became more than just one incident of discrimination. It became a lesson about power and organization and the long game of social change, a demonstration that sometimes the most effective response to humiliation is not the immediate satisfying violence, but the patient, systematic dismantling of the systems that made that humiliation possible in the first place. And in the years that followed, when other Negro people faced similar discrimination, when they were turned away from establishments that should have welcomed them, some of them remembered what Bumpy Jonson had done, remembered that quiet walk away from the Cotton Club's entrance that had led to the club's integration, and they understood that real power sometimes requires resisting the urge for immediate retaliation in favor of organizing for lasting change.